A college student got off a bus and vanished without a trace. The next day, her body was found in a field. Police spent 39 years searching for the person responsible, and it wasn't until 2019 that modern technology finally revealed the truth. In this video, we'll tell you what happened to Helene Pruszynski. Hit that subscribe button for more true stories. It's important that these voices are heard. Helene Pruszynski was born on April 6, 1958, in Huntington, a town not far from New York City. She was the youngest of 3 children. Her brother and sister were 12 and 9 years old. She grew up in a loving and caring home, got along wonderfully with her older siblings, and was known for being a positive and bright person. When she was 14, her father received a job offer, and the family had to move to the small town of Hamilton, near Boston. There, she enrolled in the local high school, where she developed a passion for singing and sports. It was also during this time that Kalin decided she wanted to pursue a career in journalism. After high school, she attended Wheaton College, located about 70 miles from her town. It was close enough for her to visit her family regularly, and the college offered a truly high-quality journalism program. Kalin quickly adapted to student life, earning excellent grades and actively participating in college activities. Eventually, an opportunity she had been eagerly waiting for came up: an internship in the news department of a radio station in Denver. Even though the city was more than 2,000 miles from her college, Kalin was thrilled about the chance. Plus, her aunt and uncle lived in Denver and agreed to let her stay with them during the internship. One of her journalism classmates went with her as well. In January 1980, 21-year-old Kalin flew to Denver and began her internship at the radio station. Every day, she had to take a bus from the office to get home. The ride took about 30 minutes, after which she had to walk a couple of miles. On January 16th, she left the radio station at 6 in the evening, as usual, and headed to the bus stop. But she never made it home. Her aunt immediately began to worry, as Kalin always called if she was going to be late. The woman waited for several hours, but at 10:30, she finally decided to contact the police. Investigators began the search immediately, fearing her disappearance might be connected to a recent series of attacks on women in the area. They searched the area along Kalen's route all night but couldn't find her. The next morning, a woman called the police. She had been driving through a suburban area of Denver with her children when they noticed someone lying in a field by the road. The mother stopped the car, walked closer, and saw the lifeless body of a young woman. When police arrived at the scene, they immediately identified Kalin. Her clothing was partially removed, and her hands were tied behind her back. All of her personal belongings were missing. Police managed to find a witness who saw Kalin getting off the bus at around 5:30. From the bus stop, she had a walk of a couple of miles ahead of her, and it seemed the attacker ambushed her somewhere along that path. Law enforcement searched the area where the body was found but came up with almost no leads, except for shoe prints, estimated to be a size 44, leading from the road to the body and back. By then, medical experts had found biological material on the victim's body and clothing, which likely belonged to the attacker. But back then, this couldn't help the investigation, as the science of DNA analysis was still in its early stages. The samples were sent to a lab for storage, in the hope that they might one day help identify the culprit. The police appealed to the public for information through newspapers and local television, trying to find witnesses who might have seen Kalin that evening. Soon, a woman came forward who had seen a man at around 10:20 p.m. near the field where the body was found. He was standing on the shoulder of the road next to a car. Unfortunately, it was dark, and the woman couldn't see the man's face clearly. She could only provide a general description, which wasn't very helpful. So, detectives took an interesting step. With the witness's consent, they brought a hypnotist to the station. Under hypnosis, the woman was able to recall more details, which were used to create a sketch of the unknown man. It's hard to say if the hypnosis session truly helped the investigation, but the fact remains, at that moment, the police had nothing but that drawing. However, they were unable to identify any suspects, and the case went cold for years. 6 months later, Kalin was posthumously awarded her diploma from college. As a tribute, the school established an award in her name for graduating students, recognizing the kind of active participation in college life that Kalin herself was known for. The investigation was only reopened in 1998, 18 years after the tragedy. By then, DNA technology had advanced significantly. Investigators entered the biological samples into the FBI's database. Unfortunately, there were no matches. This meant the perpetrator had no prior criminal record, at least not since convicts began having their DNA samples collected. Another 15 years passed, In 2013, the local police department created a cold case unit. They resumed the investigation, but no new leads were found. The DNA sample from the victim's body still hadn't matched anyone in the FBI database. This meant the young woman's killer hadn't been on the police's radar for any other potential crimes all this time. Throughout these years, it wasn't just the police and Kalen's family trying to find the truth. Her high school friends from the choir were also actively involved. Decades after her death, they continued to urge detectives to regularly review the case. They also gave interviews to keep the story in the public eye, and distributed flyers with information about Kalen's murder along her bus route. In 2017, the case was reopened once again, and this time, detectives had far more tools at their disposal. By then, forensic science had begun to actively use genetic genealogy, a method that could identify a suspect through their relatives. Of course, this was a very complex and lengthy process. Also, it only worked if the DNA holder's relatives were in publicly accessible genetic databases. In 2018, police sent the existing DNA samples to Parabon, a lab that had already helped solve hundreds of similar cases. The experts had to examine about 3,000 matches, which included even very distant relatives of the presumed killer. Then, they had to filter out those who didn't fit the age profile or couldn't have committed the crime for other reasons. Ultimately, the experts determined that the DNA holder was, with a high degree of probability, the son of a woman named June Stotts, who was no longer alive. The problem was that she had 4 sons, but the lab could only identify 2 of them. At the time of the murder, they were 10 and 11 years old, so they were immediately ruled out. The search for the other 2 sons stalled, and experts began to explore other possibilities. Another year went by, and then something unexpected happened. A woman named Jessie submitted her DNA sample to a public database. Experts at Parabon immediately saw that Jessie was a fairly close relative of Kalen's killer and contacted her. Through a more detailed DNA analysis, they determined that the killer was Jessie's 3rd cousin. Detectives asked her to provide information about her family to finally identify the suspect. Luckily, Jessie was a fan of true crime podcasts, much like the case of Kaelen. That's why she had uploaded her data to the public database. She understood that her decision could help solve a case. However, she never imagined it would happen the moment she uploaded her data. The woman began to gather information about her family tree and asked both of her parents to submit their DNA to the database. Thanks to this, experts determined that the killer was related to Jessie through her paternal line. Unfortunately, the search for answers dragged on for several more months. The experts, detectives, and Jessie's family worked together to close in on the owner of the DNA from the crime scene, and soon, they finally had a breakthrough. The police were able to contact a relative of June Stotts, who shared new details about her older sons. It turned out, the woman had suffered from mental health issues, and after one of her breakdowns, the boy's father had taken them to another city. Their names were William and Curtis. The detectives now had to figure out which of them was the killer. The answer came quickly. Police discovered that William had been in and out of prison multiple times. His DNA sample had been entered into the FBI database in 2010. Since Kalen's case file had been run against that database numerous times, William was not the killer. A downside of this database is that it only shows exact matches, not partial ones, even between brothers. As a result, 39 years after the murder, police had their prime suspect, Curtis White, who also used the surname Clinton. It turned out this man also had an extensive criminal history. At 18, he knocked on a woman's door and asked to use her phone. Once inside, he pulled out a knife and committed a violent act against the victim, then fled. He was quickly caught and sentenced to 30 years, but he was released after just 4. He was granted early parole because an employee of a Christian institution for troubled teens, where Curtis had spent time before turning 18, vouched for him. This man claimed he was willing to house the offender in his own home and find him a job. It's hard to imagine bringing a convict into your home with your wife and 5 children, but the man asked the court to release Curtis under these exact conditions. After his release, Curtis moved in with him and got a job as a gardener. At the time of Kalen's murder, he was living in that area. He later moved to Florida, which is where detectives went in 2019. Curtis was 62 years old by then and worked as a truck driver. Before charging him, investigators wanted more solid evidence. They watched him for about a week, trying to secretly obtain a sample of his DNA. First, they retrieved a milk carton from his trash can and sent it to the lab. Experts found DNA on it, but it was too little to analyze. On November 30th, detectives followed him to a bar where the suspect drank several beers from the same glass. As soon as he left, The glass was collected and sent to a lab in Colorado. The transport and analysis took nearly a month, but in the end, the detectives had the result they had been waiting for. The sample from the victim's body was a perfect match to Curtis's DNA. He was arrested on December 11th and charged with the murder of Kaelen. The man denied his involvement, so the prosecutor prepared to take the case to trial. He was extradited to Colorado, and that's when something unexpected happened. On the way there, he slowly began to confess. The detectives escorting him listened to all the details. Curtis said he was driving down the street when he noticed a lone girl getting off a bus. He pulled out a knife, forced her into his car, drove her out of town, assaulted her, and then ended her life. He was ultimately sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Given that he will be 82 by then, it's quite possible the criminal won't live to see that day. Sadly, most of Kalen's own relatives didn't live to see her killer brought to justice either. Her parents and older brother had passed away many years earlier, leaving only her older sister. Almost 40 years later, the elderly woman received a phone call from the police department, finally telling her that the case had been solved. There is one last chilling detail to this story. As you may remember, around the time of Kalen's murder, there were numerous reports of attacks on women in Denver. These crimes all shared a similar pattern. Detectives now believe that Curtis was behind them, but they will likely never be able to prove it. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like the video to help it reach more people.